we're doing a knitting video. This is normally a book channel, but we are getting to a time of the year where a lot of people are starting to think about their plans for the next year. And I feel like this, at least here in the Northern Hemisphere, we're going into the winter. People are kind of cozying in, and it's a good time of year to think about maybe picking up a new hobby, especially if that hobby has to do with warm, cozy fibers like knitting. So I had thought about making a video of like advice for beginners or where to start with beginners or tips or whatever. And I wasn't sure quite when to do it, but for whatever reason, just it feels like this is a good time to just go ahead and put this out. So I am going to be talking about advice. It's kind of an advice slash tips to other people slash what I would tell myself if I were starting to learn to knit now, knowing what I know. So I made a list, as is my wont, and I had a lot more things on here than I thought I would. So grab something cozy up with. I'm gonna work on a project that's just in plain stockinette right now. Well, actually technically garter, but where I'm just knitting back and forth. So hopefully I don't have to look down too much. These are the things I would tell myself if I were starting to learn to knit today, and it literally just started flurrying outside. How perfect. It's wintertime treats. I love the winter. I know that's controversial. I feel like there's no place for us in society, people who love the cold, but that's me. I love it. Okay, so I have a list of 24 things, so I'm going to try to stay on topic and not get too chatty, but this will inevitably be a somewhat chatty video. Okay, so first of all, in the planning phase, number one, just try it. Just try it. If you are interested in learning how to knit, that means you should just give it a go. It may not be for you, it may not be successful, but you should just give it a good old college try. And honestly, between knitting and learning to sew garments, I kind of believe everybody should have to make at least one garment in their life so that they have sufficient appreciation for how hard it is to make garments. There is no such thing as a fully machine-made garment. It always involves human labor. And I think if you have had to do that human labor, you definitely value your clothing more. I value my store-bought clothes so much more. I take better care of them, and I have more like care and respect for picking them out. So I think that's something everybody should try, and I think you should just try it. Give it a go. If it's a total flop for you, you'll move on. In terms of how to try it, I learned from YouTube. Well, my great aunt showed me the basics of knitting and purling back when I was a kid, but when I was like actually trying to make garments, I just looked into YouTube. But there are a ton of resources available. A lot of local, at least here in the US, a lot of libraries will have classes for free. There's a lot of local yarn stores who will have classes. I did actually a crochet class at my local yarn store this summer, and it was, I think, $10 a class for 4 classes, which, you know, for me was affordable. So if you want to learn in person, that's an option. If you have a friend who knits, I can almost guarantee you they will be absolutely thrilled, or a relative, to show you how to do it. But there's a lot of resources available. If you are looking for some books, because I tend to be somebody who likes to read the steps and then watch someone do it. Of all of the books that I picked up, because, you know, this is a book channel, I love books and I love craft books. The 2 that I would most recommend, this one is sadly, I think, out of print because Pom Pom is no longer with us, but I'm pretty sure that there are copies of this still floating around secondhand. And this is Knit How. Not only do I find the steps in this to be really clear and a good explanatory primer, but I've tried, I think, 2 of the patterns, and they were both well written and easy to follow. So if you want a how-to book that includes some patterns with it of places to start, this I would recommend. And then I would say the Colorwork Bible by Jessie Ostermiller. The pattern that I have tried to knit from this had a couple of fundamental things missing from it, which for beginners is not good. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend the patterns in this, but I highly recommend her descriptions of how to do different types of color work. And she has these little, I'll just obscure this a little bit, but she has little practice tests or like homework for you, basically, of like, hey, here's a little chart. go practice this particular form of color work with it. So I thought that perfect if you're trying to learn how to do color work is just some swatches. So these are the 2 books I would recommend, but there are dozens, if not hundreds of them, and many of them are probably available at your library. So all that to say, this is it can be a very expensive craft, but it certainly doesn't have to be. And I think when you're getting started, there's a lot of free resources available. Yeah. Just try it. Give it a go. Number 2, when you're picking your project, I recommend starting with something that A, you actually want to own, and B, that takes into account your patience level. So I actually don't think, there's a lot of controversy about like what should your first attempt be. I think that the best first project is one that you actually want because you will be motivated to actually get through it. I think you have to find the balance because I think starting with a sweater or a cardigan or something might be the thing that you actually really want. So that might be the place to start if you think that you have enough patience to get through that whole process. But if this takes some self-awareness basically on your own part. If you're somebody who's going to get impatient with what is intrinsically a very slow process and you need a little quicker gratification, the little mini scarves that are very on trend, or at least they've been popular in the knitting world. And I think they've in general been more of a thing recently. That could be a good first project. A hat is a classic. Socks, possibly, if you're willing to work at a smaller gauge, but pick something that you actually want that matches your patience level. That's the right project for you. How to find that first project? There's so many YouTube videos out there of pattern roundups, of free pattern roundups for beginners. If I had to just kind of give you a couple of places to start, I haven't knit it, but I have seen enough experienced knitters talking about how good the step-by-step sweater and cardigan from Florence Miller is that I would recommend that possibly as a place to start. In terms of the clearest and best pattern writers that I've encountered, this is actually from the Knit Pearl Girl, and I would say this is one of the clearest patterns with lots of making sure you have the right number of stitches breaks in it that I've ever read. I think Emily Curtis's Color Tip Tea was extremely clear and well written. So those are some recommendations of folks I've tried. For socks, I think Summer Lee's free pattern is really clear. So there's plenty of resources out there, but this is where, again, you've got to know yourself and pick something that you truly want based on the myriad of recommendations that you can get out there free from experienced knitters. The only specific advice or tip I'll give you is that if you are starting with a sweater, I would highly recommend starting with one that is knit in the round top down, mostly the top down part, because I think in terms of figuring out how to size things, that is a much more forgiving process than bottom up, which that's a whole other video. So once you have picked your project, then go pick your yarn. Do not flip these 2 things. This is a mistake I made as a beginner, and I'm still trying to address that in my stash even to this day. So start with what the project is. Then what you're gonna do is you're either gonna look and see what is the recommended yarn and buy that, if that is within your preferences and budget, because then you know that it's a good yarn for the project, or go to your local yarn store and ask. Some local yarn stores have a reputation of being less friendly. That has not been my experience. I've only been in a couple of local yarn stores in my travels where I did not feel a good welcoming vibe, but obviously mileage may vary there, but most local yarn stores will be happy to see what you're trying to make and make some recommendations to you based on your specific needs and your budget. You could do that. You can go onto Ravelry and look at the project, and it has like a little tab where it says recommended yarn, so you could look there. Or if all else fails, actually not even if all else fails, a great place to start would be to go to Reddit. Reddit knitters are very helpful. If you've got a question, you can't figure out what's going on, you can probably search and find an answer, or if you need help, tons of people will be more than happy to help you on there. So don't, trying to pick a pattern to go with your yarn, or just like not thinking about how those 2 things go together is a mistake. And you will learn quickly the problems that come along with that. So avoid that. That's something I didn't do, and that's something I should have done. Another consideration when you're picking your pattern is if it's going to be a lot of stockinette. Now, stockinette is basically your typical, like if you have a machine-made knit sweater, you probably have a sweater that is mostly stockinette. That's this fabric. Something to keep in mind, and actually it doesn't show up as much on the camera, but in person I notice it, and hopefully I can block this out more the next time I block this sweater. But something you don't know as a beginner is that a lot of pictures online kind of camouflage the reality of what your garment is going to look like. And a key way that some designers camouflage things proactively so that the pictures that get posted look better is that they include a strand of mohair or of some kind of fluffy yarn. And that's because that fluff obscures the stitch tension. I'm currently holding a mohair with a lace, and it's covering up a lot of my tensioning issues. The fluffiness covers a multitude of sins, one could say. So just know it's more expensive to get the fluffy yarn to go with the non-fluffy yarn, but if you are worried about how the intention of the garment is going to look, you need to look up pictures of people who just used one strand to get a more realistic goal in mind for what your fabric is going to look like. I don't know if that made sense, but basically the fluff can cover up some tensioning issues that you are likely to have as a beginner, so that's the plus side. The downside is it's more expensive because you're buying 2 yarns for the same yardage twice, and mohair can be quite expensive. The fluffy yarns generally, it's harder to find budget options, especially if you're like me and you have some sensory and sensitivity issues. So just know that in terms of selecting your project and the overall cost of what you're wanting to put in / what the results might look like. Also, I'm talking with my hands so much that I really should just basically put this down. I failed to knit and talk this time because I'm passionate. So let's specifically talk about yarn. So because I learned to sew before I learned to knit, I learned the lesson in sewing that your materials do have a really dramatic impact on your outcomes a lot of times. It's not just the process, it's the materials themselves. And in sewing, it means getting fabrics that are nice enough to behave correctly in the steps of sewing, that doesn't take like an expert level to get them to do what you want them to do, is really important. So like working with a very cheap stretch fabric as a beginner is very challenging. At least it was for me as a sewist when I was learning. Whereas like a nice wool or a nice linen or cotton blend, like those are a little easier to work with. So I took that into knitting and thought, oh, that means I should probably start with these like really nice luxury hand-dyed yarns. While those were not a bad thing to start with, I could have had the same quality of yarn for a more affordable price point. You're basically looking for something where if you have problems, it's not because of the yarn. That's the goal, is you want something that is in your budget, that is nice enough to get you what you're trying to achieve. And I would say that if you are in the US, we have fewer options because insert long history lesson here about how our like wool production was wiped out basically. I saw a really interesting presentation about this at the Nashville Fiber Festival. Tennessee, like this area that I'm in, used to be one of the biggest wool producing areas in the country in the US, but then with the rise of cotton, that went away. So in the US, we have fewer affordable yarn choices for natural fibers. And I will say for me, I have sensory issues with acrylic yarn, which is a lot more affordable and accessible here in the US, as well as certain types of like more rustic or like scratchier yarns. I have some skin condition stuff that's a byproduct of my autoimmune disease. So that is a trickier proposition for me personally. So I'm going to just basically be talking about natural fibers because that's what my skin can tolerate. In the US, there are fewer options than there are in Europe. There's just other places in the world, including like South America, etc., that have just more wool available or more natural fibers available and produced en masse than the US does. So the goal is to find good enough yarn so that the yarn isn't impacting your product, but everyone's budget and sensory needs are different. So take that overall guidance and then apply it to your situation. If you are tempted by some of the beautiful hand-dyed yarns out there, number 6 thing I've learned is Make sure if you're gonna buy the variegated yarn that you see a swatch of it so that you're not just fooled by how beautiful it looks in the hank, because the variegation is a strong choice, and I like variegation for some projects, not others. One, to show you what I mean by that. So like this one from Megs & Co. This is beautiful. See how it has all these different speckles and colors? It looks beautiful in this hank, but it doesn't look like this when it's knit up. So before I bought this one, I looked up swatches of what this looked like when it was knit up, because sometimes you won't like the variation for like different projects. So if you're knitting a full sweater out of this, you need to make sure that you like that fabric that it's producing, versus maybe you're more into this for a scarf or some socks, or I think in my case I was going to do like a shawlette with this. So just make sure to do your due diligence to make sure before you buy the beautiful and usually expensive variegated yarn that you actually like the fabric it produces for the project that you have in mind. Next is, in my experience, so when you're trying to figure out how much yarn you need to buy, the pattern will tell you based on the size that you select how much yarn you need. It is my experience that most of the time this is overestimated, minimally about 10%, but for some designers, I would say it's more consistently like 20%. That's something that you'll get to know if you knit the same designer multiple times, slash depending on the designer, they may have like a reputation for having over or underestimated yarns. I've knit so many things from Rebecca Clow, who's also I think a pretty beginner friendly pattern designer. Maybe like the Tolsta T would be a good beginning pattern. And I know her estimates well enough to know that usually I'm like 20% under what she's recommending. Whereas like Sari Nordland, I usually expect I'll need like 10-ish% more, but these are things you get to know. All that to say, just know that most of the time the pattern is overestimating the yardage you need just to be on the safe side, but you're gonna have to decide how willing you are to play yarn chicken, which means are you willing to go right up to the very end of the ball? Or if you're like me, I find that very anxiety inducing. So I would rather get, like if I calculate that I need 7.5 skeins of a yarn, I would rather go ahead and buy the 8 rather than the 7. But you'll have to decide how much you're willing to skirt the line. And if you do have to go back and buy more, just know that sometimes there's differences between dye lots. There could be subtle differences in color. If you're getting commercially produced yarn, that's much less likely to happen, but it definitely does happen. Know your own tolerance for how close you'll get to the line. Number 8, it's so fun to go to the yarn store when you're getting started. There's so much pretty yarn. It's beautiful. You get excited. At least I'm speaking from my experience, and you just buy yarn. Including a lot of single skeins, which it turns out, especially as a plus size knitter, I have very limited use for, or I should say as a plus size garment, primarily garment knitter. It is hard and I have to be purposeful to get through these single skeins that I bought early on. So I would warn you off doing that. I would also warn you off of stashing up for your next projects until you get through a few. A, because you don't know if you're gonna like it yet, so we are still in experimentation phase, you may not like this. But B, even once you decide you like it, my thoughts about how to choose the right size for me changed pretty dramatically after I had knit a few garments. I had very different ideas about which size I wanted to pick or different modifications I wanted to make. So in several cases, I bought way too much yarn for the project I wanted to make, and therefore had all of this left over, sometimes in awkward amounts that I've been having to work through. So the temptation to stash up, for me at least, as a clearly I like collecting things that I enjoy, is very high. So I would recommend trying to hold off on stashing up, even if there's a sale. That's the other thing I'm a sucker for, until you get a few projects under your belt, because you will be better able to make decisions that your future self will feel better about once you have some experience about how much yarn you need for different types of projects. And then number 9, just keep in mind sensory issues are a thing. You are rubbing this yarn against your hands for hours and hours at a time. And even if you don't think you have sensory issues, you may discover that there are different types of fibers that you do and don't like. For instance, I really struggle with really rustic yarn is what they call it. That's knitting code for scratchy. It gives me rashes. I don't enjoy that process. I also don't really like knitting with 100% cotton usually because it has the way it clings to the needles, it feels like nails on a chalkboard to me, and I just don't like it. Whereas superwash yarn really bothers some people. That's a yarn that's been treated in a way that it can go through a washing machine on the right settings and survive. Most knitting cannot. And some people hate that chemical process it goes through. They really hate the way that feels on their hands. That doesn't bother me at all. So you won't know what all your sensory issues might be until you start getting into things a little bit more. So just keep that in mind as you're selecting different yarns. If it feels good to the touch when you're kind of in the store, that's a good sign, but just know you may discover once you get into things, you may change your feelings about that. Okay, so we've got our project, we've got our yarn, we're getting started. Let's talk about the process. This is maybe the most important thing I can say that I wish I'd internalized as a beginner, and what I would say to anybody who is thinking about getting into any hobby, honestly. But in terms of knitting, mistakes are not an unexpected thing that only happens to beginners. Mistakes are a part of the knitting process forever. Like, you will always have mistakes. And really what makes a more advanced knitter is learning how to address those problems, have creative solutions for them, and having a bigger toolbox of how to solve them. But problems or like things not going the way you wanted it to is a part of the process. It's not just you're not a failure if you are having mistakes. It's an intrinsic part of this craft. Whenever you see people talking about what makes an advanced knitter, one of the first things almost everyone says is a willingness to rip back and start again. Ripping back happens all the time, and it's normal. And also just getting comfortable with what mistakes are things that you're okay with and what are mistakes that you really need to rip back for. I'm trying to think, like I had a vest I made recently where I realized once I'd gotten almost all the way through the color work chart that I had made in one row I had made a mistake that threw off the top part of the color work a little bit. And I thought about ripping back, but I realized like this is not really noticeable unless you're staring at this. And this is a handmade thing, and it's okay if there's a mistake in here. It's okay. The goal is not perfection. The goal is something that you will enjoy wearing and that you have made, at least in garment knitting. So being okay with mistakes and accepting them is a huge part of the knitting process. And also just like what mistakes you can live with and what ones you can't. And figuring out the best way to solve them is a part of growing your knitting skill. The next one is be really, really sure that you have knitting and purling correctly down early in your process so that as you're building your muscle memory, you're doing it correctly. I had misremembered how to knit and purl from when I learned as a kid. So when I took it back up as an adult, I was twisting all of my knits and purls, but in a way that is unusual. It's not the normal way people twist their knits and purls. And it took me literally a year to get both of those corrected, to figure out that's what the problem was, and then to get it corrected. And in the meantime, I had knit a ton, and so I had to relearn the muscle memory. That's a part of building your skills, is that your muscle, like you're doing a lot of repetitive motion, and you have that muscle memory after a while. So as you're learning, make sure you are doing it the correct way. Once I realized that was the problem, I fixed it, but it was a painful process to fix it. So just really be confident, figure out what kind of little ways to remember things works for you. I remember the correct way the stitch is mounted onto the needle by thinking of Cher on the gigantic gun in that video and her legs over it. and it's her right leg should be in the front. That's how I remember that. When I was learning to make one left, I would sing Read You Wrote You, and I'd say, line them up front to back. I'm sending stitches home like a heart attack. Find what works for you to correctly remember the technique so that you're building muscle memory with the correct motions. Number 12 is that gauge matters, needle size matters, and the amount of ease you want matters. And there's so many videos that go into detail about how to get that down. But really, and I'm not going to try to cover that here. I'm just going to say all of those things profoundly matter to the end garment you end up with, or just the end finished object you end up with. You could end up with a tiny sock. You could be like me and end up with a comically large sock if you don't take these things into account. So really read what the pattern is saying. Make sure you understand what it thinks your gauge is going to be. Match that up to what you actually are producing. A gauge swatch is important, I think, especially for picking the correct size. We'll then segue into number 13, because people talk about how gauge swatches lie, and they kind of do. I mean, I think if you correctly do your gauge swatch and block it, especially if you're going to be knitting in the round, you need to do your gauge swatch in the round. I think it's a good way to get to help you pick which size. I would recommend it for that. But I think that there's also this thing, gauge swatches lie, and that's because usually your tension is a little different in a 4x4 square, or a 4 inch by 4 inch or 10 centimeters by 10 centimeter square than it is over a bigger project. So my recommendation is number 13, which is do an early project block. So usually when I'm getting through the yoke, whenever I run out of yarn, when I end the ball, I'll go ahead and do a block of the yoke of the garment and then check the gauge once I've let it dry, because to me that's a much more realistic picture of what my gauge is like at scale, or like over the course of the garment. I find that to be a much more reliable gauge indicator. And if I'm significantly off gauge, usually I'll be off by like 1 stitch or so. That I'm not going to change my plans for. But if I'm significantly off gauge and I don't like the direction I'm off gauge, I will either rip back and start over with a different needle size, or depending on, there's a few different things you could do, but I think that's a more realistic picture of what your gauge is like. So I would recommend doing an early project block. If you're doing a garment, the yoke is a good time to do that. Number 14, for plus size knitters, consider using your upper bust measurement rather than your full bust measurement to pick your size. Most knitting projects that are tops use your fullest part of your bust, that measurement, as which size you should pick. For people who have a lot of volume, tissue volume on their chest, that's a less accurate way to get a well-fitting garment. If you use that, you will tend to have very oversized garments. And if that's the look you're going for, then that's what you should do. But I tend to like something that's a little less oversized. I will often use I think my fullest bust measurement. It's really, the other thing is, it's also a question of like where you have the most projection in your chest. So that's something to keep in mind. A lot of them assume that your projection is a lot higher and closer to the top of your armpit than often if you have a large chest it is. Okay, my camera overheated and I got a call, so I don't totally remember where I was. Oh, I think I was talking about gauge and then choosing a size. That sounds like what I was talking about. So yeah, just basically if you have a large chest, I would recommend picking a measurement that corresponds more to where you want to split your sleeves than to necessarily where the sizing indicates for your full bust, just because often if you have a fuller chest, the projection is a lot lower, like the fullest part is a lot lower than where you likely want your sleeves to split. And because of the nature of the knitted fabric, it really usually doesn't make that much a difference, especially if there's ease written into the pattern. So just considerations. And then for everyone, regardless of your size, knowing your key measurements is really a good thing for you just in general when you're picking clothes, in terms of your upper chest, your full chest, your hips, your upper arm circumference, all that good stuff. It will help you pick patterns better if you're familiar with what you like based on your measurements. Number 15, get your pattern in a format where you can mark it up. I personally have it's the Remarkable tablet that I have for work, but I also use it for patterns so that I can have the PDF and then digitally write on it. Taking good notes as you go is really helpful, especially if you ever want to knit the project again. And then if you have 2 of something in a project, so like 2 sleeves, 2 mittens, 2 socks, etc., taking notes about what you're doing on the first of those very much helps you make sure the second one matches it, in terms of like, decided to decrease at this round. I have short arms, so I have to fudge around with my increase and decrease with my decrease rate on sleeves usually, so taking good notes is very important. Number 16 is I would recommend putting in the collar earlier in the pattern than it will often recommend if you don't start with the collar, and that's because putting in the collar really impacts the way that the yoke sits. So if you're trying to decide if you're ready to split for sleeves on a garment, I think that going ahead and putting in that collar can really help you make a better decision about that. And on that point, number 17, you don't have, like, if the pattern is directing you to just knit the body and then come back to the sleeves, you don't have to do that. You can kind of make some progress on the body and then come back and do a sleeve, do both the sleeves. That can be a good way to break up the project and keep doing new things if that's something that you like in your knitting, which is something I like. And also, if you do go ahead and put in the sleeves, sometimes that can impact the kind of way the garment is sitting or hanging, and it can impact how long you want to knit the body. So a good thing to keep in mind. To that point, you should be trying your project on as you go to make sure that it's fitting the way that you want it to, that you can still make changes if you need to, and also so you know the right place to stop. Then number 19, you're gonna have to figure out what works best for you for small circumference knitting. Even if you are somebody who primarily wants to be a garment knitter, you're gonna have small circumferences on your wrists or the sleeves and at the neck. So figuring out the best way that you like is something worth doing as you go along. I realize that I'm a short fixed circumference girly. That's my preference, followed by DPNs, followed by magic loop. But different people have different approaches. There's a lot of different ways you can tackle short circumferences for hats or socks or whatever. And it takes some trial and error to figure out your preferred method. But if you try one and don't like it, keep trying other methods, because you probably can find one that you can deal with. Because if you are not liking the method, it makes the whole process very frustrating. And then a couple of other process things. So number 20 is that finishing makes a huge difference to the end product. People don't like weaving in ends. It's not that hard to do, I don't think. It's annoying if you wait to do all of it at the end. But if you kind of do it as you go, it's not that big of a deal, and you will appreciate that later on. Getting different types of finishing in different places as you go, I think, is valuable, and like what the good enough version is. So for example, on my hems, I always bind off in pattern, because when I've done more complicated types of casting off, I never find that it's that big of a difference on the bottom hem, but I do find that it's a big enough difference on my sleeves. So like this, for instance, is an Italian tubular cast off, and it's not that much harder than a sewn Italian cast off, which I also like doing. I think this one also is a tubular, but you know, you'll pick up as you go which ones you like doing and like what the good enough version is. Leveling up and figuring out what is good enough that's going to make you happy with the finishings that you have, I think is a good way to be more satisfied with your garments. Doing the bare minimum that doesn't actually satisfy what you want, I think, is a formula to not feeling satisfied at the end of the project. So you'll learn as you go which ones are more worth it and less worth it to you, but whatever you land on, make yourself put in the time to do the one that is to your standard. And then 21 is just the tools that I actually use all the time. There's tons of really fun, you know, doodads and whatnot, you know, out there, and they're fun to have, but they're definitely not required. The things that I use, I think I titled this, things I use every time I knit. Honestly, of all of these, I'm gonna say my little kitchen scale, because I am paranoid about not having enough yarn. So weighing my yarn as I go, if I'm cutting it close, makes me feel better. And also I like to keep my Ravelry stash up to date. And so I use this to update that as I go, so I can see. It feels like it's gamification for me. It feels like I'm seeing the yarn amounts go down and therefore am achieving something. I use this little guy to count rows. No, I'm not using this for anything right now. So it makes me feel like I'm counting people in to the county fair, which I like. And for me, this is my preferred method of row counting, whether you write or use the little other counters. I've seen people like use these little locking stitch markers to keep track of how many increases they need to do on a sleeve. Whatever counting method works for you, you should get comfortable with. For me, this has become my preferred method. Speaking of the little locking stitch markers, I use these, or I do have, you know, a couple of fancier little ones to denote start and stop of rounds, things like that. But I am a big fan of using stitch markers to keep track of where I am in the round in particular. I'll use different colors for like sleeves versus front and back, things like that, but you gotta have a little stitch marker. Or if I've noticed that I've dropped a stitch, but I'm already past it, I'll put this into the stitch to remind myself to pick it up and ladder back the next time I'm there. Love a stitch stopper. This is the one that comes with a lot of these like knitting kits, and it's fine, but for me, I do like the security of knowing my stitches are gonna stay on after I put a project down, so I always use those. My preferred method of trying on something is to use some barber cord. You can get this pretty inexpensively online, like long tubes of it, or you can pick this up at a lot of craft stores, but this is a way to slip your stitches off the needles and be able to try on more easily. This is my preferred method. I like it better than using scrap yarn or these little stitch holders that come in a bunch of different sizes. I'll use both of these for some situations, but generally I'm a barber cord kind of girly. I use a little crochet hook for if I need to pick something up or fix something. Gotta have your tapestry needle. This is not my preferred tapestry needle. I like the one from Clover that kind of looks like this, but as a tapestry needle, but this is the one that's here in my office. And then for cabling, I prefer the hooks over the needles, but you can use needles, or you can learn how to do cabling without, which I can do for one cable, but I haven't figured out beyond that, but I will someday, and we'll get to that. Okay, so that's process. 3 last things for reflection. Number 1, when you get to the end of your first project or projects, pay attention to what you personally did and did not like in the process. The ideal knit is one that you enjoy the process, you will use and enjoy the product, something that fits your style and something that's actually useful to your like wardrobe needs. That's the perfect project, which honestly this was, because this is like a pullover. Been dying to do the like shoulder button placket. I love the way this looks. I love some stripes. The stripes kept this from being boring to me, because I have discovered that I'm somebody who doesn't like a mostly stockinette project. I find that just, it's not engaging enough for me normally, but by adding in the stripes at the bottom after I got through the yoke, that actually was perfect, because the body and the sort of sleeve part is the stuff that I don't like as much. So this was a kind of a perfect project now that I'm thinking about it. I happen to be wearing it today, but it's a great illustration of, for me, something that's combining what I like to wear with what I like to do. And pay attention to that as you go. Maybe you love the way cables look, but it's really hard on your hands and you don't enjoy it. Maybe you don't really like colorwork sweaters, but you really like the process of color work and you are more okay with it in an accessory of some kind. You know, maybe you like higher weight yarn to knit, but you don't like the way it looks. These are things that you'll have to kind of figure out of your own preferences so that you're picking projects that you enjoy and enjoy having. That's like the perfect marriage. I personally think it's a great policy to try to incorporate a new skill in every project. It doesn't have to be something crazy, but like a new way to cast on, a new way to do increases or decreases, maybe a new stitch pattern you haven't tried, a new construction type. Almost every project still, and I've probably knit, oh God, this is crazy to say, but I've probably knit like 50 garments at this point, and I'm still always finding something new to do in every one. Sometimes it's me retrying something I tried before and didn't like, or couldn't figure out how to make it work. My policy is if there's a technique that the pattern calls for, I have to at least try to do it. And if I can't figure it out that go around, then I might just do a different technique. Like I still haven't figured out how to do a tubular cast on. I can do the tubular cast off, but not the tubular cast on to get a collar that's stretchy enough. But every time it calls for it, I try it, and I have not yet perfected it, but I tried it. And when it doesn't work, then I go back and do my good old long tail cast on, because that's good enough and I at least tried. So I would say just every time try to learn something. Baby knits are a great way to practice something new, because it's on such a small scale, and if you mess it up, it feels much less demoralizing than a full adult garment. But yeah, don't be afraid to constantly just be trying something new. And if it doesn't work out, either you can do a different technique, or if you just really can't get it to work and you have to do it for the project, then like you can just put that project aside. And then finally, now this is my last piece of advice for beginners once they have completed a couple of projects, okay? Because you got to get used to finishing things up top. But once you have actually finished things, going forward, it's okay to realize that a project wasn't what you thought it was going to be and to give up on it. Don't fall prey to the sunk cost fallacy, even like at any point in the process. I did this the other day, I cast on a cowl that I was going to make for someone for Christmas, and I just realized that the yarn that I had wasn't really giving me the result I wanted, and I realized I could just keep going with this. I'm about a quarter of the way through, but I'm not going to have something I feel proud to give to someone when I finish this. So I'll chalk up this particular yarn combo as a learning experience, that something I thought I could cheat. Basically, I had yarns in different gauges and I thought that I could kind of cheat it in the color work, and it didn't work, and that's okay. So I just ripped it out, aka frogged it at that point. It's okay to do that at any point in the project. If you realize that you've been knitting the wrong size and you're not going to be happy with the size, you can rip back to where you can make the changes that you need, or you can just start over. That's fine. I haven't done this yet. I surely probably will soon. I have one in mind in particular where routinely, when they're going through their hand knit wardrobe, like you'll see these videos on YouTube of like, I thought that I was gonna like this, but now that I'm wearing it, I don't really like this. And I'm just gonna frog the entire thing, reclaim the yarn, and knit something else. That's just a part of it. And it feels bad, I guess, but like if you enjoy the actual process, it's really okay, because you're still knitting, you're still enjoying the process of knitting it. It's slow fashion. It's not supposed to be, something that happens overnight. And it feels good when you have something that you feel good in, or that you feel proud of after you've put in all the effort. You're putting in a lot of effort, so you want to feel good at the end of it. And if you don't, try again. And if you realize at some point in the process you're not going to feel good at the end of it, just figure out the right step to change that. Okay, this was much longer than I thought it was going to be, so I will wrap it up here. But those are my thoughts, my advice, tips, tricks, what I wish I'd known when I started knitting. I am far from an advanced knitter. I would say I'm a confident intermediate at this point. I'd love to hear what other people think about this. There's plenty of other videos like this, but these are just my 2 cents. Camera's gonna overheat again, so I gotta go. I hope you are well. Take care of yourself, take care of your neighbors. Hit the bell if you wanna know when I'm gonna post, because I don't know. And yeah, I'll just be back soon with, I'm assuming, a book-related video.